Hi, I'm Ted Wolfe, presented by Guidewise. Welcome to the Implementors podcast, where we connect you to the stories and insights of people who have mastered implementation. Why? Because ideas are easy, but implementation is hard. Join us as we uncover the secrets of successful implementation so you can conquer your implementation struggles. Welcome to the Implementors podcast presented by Guidewise, where we focus on the topic of implementation because ideas are easy, implementation is hard. Today, my guest is Dr. Brian Licuanan, comes to us from California, and he's a board-certified psychologist with the state of California. He also is the author of a book, How to Get Your Resisting Loved One into Treatment. Welcome, Dr. Brian.
Thank you, Ted. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Brian, what is it that led you to the area of psychology as a focus? You've got a academic background. If you could tell us a little bit about that, that's very, very interesting and thorough. But what led you to this particular focus in your life?
Well, I really appreciate that question. And it's a question I get at times. And I'm really enjoy talking about it because I think it can help people who are out there who are maybe struggling with a career path. And so in a summary, my career path wasn't direct. I did not end up here. This was not what I was originally intended. I had original intentions of exploring law enforcement at one point. I was in the medical school route, and I was actually in another PhD program called Industrial Organizational Psychology, which had nothing to do with therapy, so to speak, but these are your human resource consultants. These are consultants who may work on Wall Street. They're researchers who collect data information. They create instruments to choose the right employees. They work on effective culture in the work environment, to helping with downsizing and so forth. And so, I was in a PhD program, and I just realized that was not a optimal fit for me. That just wasn't something that I feel like I envisioned doing as a life career. However, I was doing some clinical counseling psychology work prior, after my undergraduate degree, and working with physically emotionally abused adolescents. And that kind of gave me an idea of the importance of mental health. And then after that field, when I didn't end up finishing the PhD program in industrial organizational psychology, there was a counseling clinical program in that same university, and it was just a seamless transition. And ever since then, it's just been a nonstop for me in terms of chasing my passion. And I didn't follow this field until my early 30s. And like I said before, I really tell people that I feel like I have a second chapter in my life, like a reset. And so that's kind of the quick runaround, so to speak, on how I got to this field. And I enjoy this field because I believe it's in line with my values, my principles, and my skills and abilities. And it is so broad, and you can work with a lot of different avenues in this field. And of course, mental health is definitely on the rise in need. And so I'm really glad where I ended up.
Mental health is, in some respects, it could be looked at as a puzzle. And I find we talk in this podcast with an awful lot of business people and ask them what drives them. What is it? And they say, I love just the puzzle of putting the business together, making all the different parts working and everything like that. I would imagine we could look at the field of mental health in the same light, putting the puzzle together, the different pieces and what's going on. Well, one of the challenges that business owners and business leaders throughout the entire organization have is being able to identify the problem and being able to give it a name, so to speak. In your book, you talk and define the word disease. Could you define that for us right now?
Yes. Well, disease, right? That's one thing I do a lot, whether it be in my talks and support groups, or of course in my book as well, is this clarification of terminologies out there. There's a lot of well-meaning terminologies that I find a lot of families may misinterpret and take it the wrong way. And disease is one of those. When we say disease, sometimes people get different reactions to it. And so disease in the medical model, there's actually is not one unified definition of disease in the medical arena, in the mental health field. So the medical disease could be this entity with symptomologies And so you can have a diabetes, a disease, Crohn's disease, a cardiac disease, and then mental health. You can have a psychiatric condition with psychiatric condition, depression, anxiety. That's also a form of disease. And the way I conceptualize a disease on a more broadband level is any entity that has caused been chronic in one's life and has caused chronic impairment. And so a disease in that arena can be anything. Um, doesn't necessarily fall into the medical model or the mental health model. For example, selfishness can be a version of a disease. And there's no medical definition for it, or it's not found in the mental health arena. But if it causes problems in your life, that's your version of disease. Racism can be your disease or entity. Materialism, hedonism, the constant seeking of pleasure. And so in that case, we all have our version of our own disease. In the Alcoholics Anonymous arena or the Anonymous arena, um, disease, they define it as something that makes you not at ease. And so, in that sense, if we all have a version of disease, we're all in some form of recovery. Sometimes we think of recovery, oh, what medical condition are you recovering from, or what substance are you recovering from? But we're all recovery to me is any planned place for a better outcome. So we all have a form of not only a disease or diseases, we all have our form of recovery. And I do believe that's the essence in everyone's life. If everyone focuses on their best recovery, I believe the world can be just a different and better place.
I love what you just explained. Let me ask, is there a difference in terminology or understanding between the word disease and addiction?
I believe they interplay in many ways. I believe addiction is a form of a disease, and so, and like I said, if it's an entity in your life that's been long lasting and hard to manage, and it causes impairment to your life, yeah, addiction is a form of a disease for sure. And it just every disease has its own presentation and symptoms, but yeah, absolutely, I would refer definitely under the umbrella of disease addiction, among other things as well.
And does the word addiction imply a physical type of substance? Or is it very valid also to say you have a psychology or a psychological addiction?
Mm-hmm. So,
Materialism, not feeling complete.
mhm,
They have a lot of different terms out there they use today.
mhm,
Fear of being rejected, and shyness, all those
mhm,
types of things.
mhm.
So is addiction basically then just physical dependent or not necessarily?
No, not necessarily. There's all forms of addiction. So, in a very general sense, addiction is when you are engaging in some type of behavior um, where it's hard to stop, right? And you do it even if you are aware that it's causing harm in your life. You could do it anyway. And like I said, it causes impairment in one or more areas of your life. And so there's all kinds of addiction, right? It doesn't have to be physical. Definitely in the work that I do, it's definitely not just physical. There are physical addictions or physical withdrawals, but there's also definitely a huge mental, emotional component to it as well. And for sure. And so, for example, I'm a big believer that whenever someone chronically struggles with a substance, let's say alcoholism, alcohol, for instance, to ever say that someone is purely an alcoholic, they don't struggle with anything else, that is very, very hard for me to believe, is because it's not so much what came first. Are you an alcoholic because you have some mental health issue, or do you have a health issue because of the alcoholism? To me, it doesn't matter. If you're struggling at that level, both of them are important, but it's very hard for me to ever differentiate that substance abuse or some type of addiction to some type of entity is devoid of any type of mental or emotional part. A lot of the times, this entity that we use to cope, like for alcoholism, is a sophisticated way to deal with distress in one's life in the form of emotional or mental stress. So I do not believe they're mutually exclusive. I've never ever seen where someone comes into treatment and say, "Yeah, I struggle with heroin," and that's it. That there's no mental health component. Well, yeah, I had suffered from traumas at an early age, or yeah, I've stress in my marriage, or I have low self worth, and so they are definitely intertwined in many ways.
So would it be correct to assume then that the addiction itself is their escape, their safe harbor where they go to, fleeing from mental health because they just don't know how to go there? Would
It
that be
can be
accurate?
that a lot of the reasons why I believe people have turned to some type of substance or some type of addiction is to bring some type of balance to a level of imbalance. And a lot of times those imbalance come in the form of a stressor. A stressor
Mhm.
could be a financial stress, emotional stress, some event in their life. So yes, it is some way bringing some level of perceived balance or stress management in their life.
So then let's start, if we can, unpacking this whole treatment concept, if we can. We have a disease. We may know that we're addicted to something. It could be a mental, not just a physical addiction that we're trying to deal with. And we know we have to stop. At some point, the realization comes to us. I'm a business owner. I'm an alcoholic. I'm trying to get away from the fear of all the uncertainty and fear of failure. So when I go home at night, I have maybe one or two extra glasses of wine or whatever it is. How do they begin to stop?
The person who is struggling, how do they begin to stop
Yes.
or managing that behavior?
Yes.
Well, one of the big things, and one of the things I do talk about is speaking back to the disease, is I personify the disease as this personified meaning giving it some type of human like attributes, is because this entity is a separate component. You take away this entity, and I say there's a lot of families in treatment with their loved one struggling. I said, tell me about your loved one prior to their struggle. Oh my God, this you'd be amazed of the talent and the skills that these people have. Well, oh my gosh, yeah, my son was valedictorian in high school. My daughter was a collegiate athlete. You know, my husband is a successful business owner, and it's countless. And that's what I tell them is that we want to fight against that disease. And when we can externalize that disease as a separate entity, understanding its patterns, its behaviors, its tendencies, and that's something we can, it's a lot more concrete and tangible. And so, not that it says that this disease is the excuse for someone's behavior, but it just gives us something to work with. Because I believe anything that we make from ambiguous or convoluted to more concrete and defined, I believe we have a better chance of creating a plan for it. And so, one of the things when I talk about the disease is there's all kinds of def, characteristics that I attribute to disease. And some of this is from the anonymous arenas, like it's cunning, it's very baffling, it's powerful. I call it relentless. I call it ageless, 18 or 80, untreated, it's the same disease. And its job is just to replicate. And one of the ways disease thrives is through isolation. And if you think of anybody that's really chronic in their substance use, is they're usually doing it in isolation. And so the one way someone can stop is to be humble and say, I need help. Because this disease doesn't want you to tell anyone. It wants you to hide behind the scenes. It wants you to drink or use your substance behind closed doors. So the first thing you have to do is tell yourself, I need help, and to telling yourself and get that help. That's the first thing you can do. And be humble enough to know when things are not going well. If you are drinking two glasses of wine, you're having difficulty sleeping, you're more irritable with your partner, you're not spending time with loved ones, your work flow is decreasing, you're getting negative feedback at work, you have to be humble enough to say, okay, there's an issue here.
Would it be correct to assume then that the disease is not you? It's your behavior.
I would say that I because what happens a lot is when people have been struggling for a long time, this disease becomes a defining feature of who they are, right? Whether it be trauma. I've literally had people who had traumatic experience in their life, and that's their narrative. That's their narrative in their life. Like, well, this is where I've been. This is who I've been abused, or I've alcoholic parents, or I've been an alcoholic all my life, and it becomes their defining feature. It is a footnote of your life, just like anything else. Great qualities as well. It's a footnote. It's not a defining feature. And so I do like to. It's not that like I said, it's not an excuse for, oh, well, it's my disease that's causing me to drink. It just gives that there's this separate entity that we've got to manage and learn and to treat it. And so, absolutely, I look at it as this a separate entity that we've got to identify. There's always a saying that your disease is always in the corner doing push-ups,
Mhm,
you know,
mhm.
and it's true, right? To me, it's never going to be gone. If someone struggled for a long period of time with anxiety, depression, um, substance abuse. It's always going to be around. Our job is to manage it and prevent it from the perfect storm from creating it, but it's always going to be a risk factor.
Well, I love the idea that it is a separate entity and it's not you. And that leads me back to your book. And you have in chapter 3 a poem that's called I Am Your Disease by
Mm,
Joanne. I thought
yeah.
that was extremely well spoken and targeted from the perspective of that separate entity talking to you. I highly recommend getting the book just to be able to read that poem. You mentioned and give the story how you read it very often to people that you're taking through work, your workflow, if I can use that word, of treatment. What's the reaction you get from people when
Mm,
they hear that poem?
mhm. Well, when I would used to run groups, especially, I would try to bring in other material, creative material, and I would bring in poems and different poems. And sometimes the past poems would click or not. But ever since I came across this one, this is the one I've stuck to, whether it be read it to families or people, because it was very provocative, emotionally evoking for them. Is because if you, for those of your listeners who aren't aware, there's a poem written there by someone who is anonymous, so to speak. And I'm not sure if Joanne's her true name or maybe only her first name, but she's talking about her, I'm assuming, struggling with some type of a substance use. And what happens in the poem is the first three-quarters of it is talking about her relationship with the disease, the characteristics of the disease. She'll say things like, it can pick you up and drop you at its moment's notice. Who was there with you when you needed me? So it talks about this intimate relationship that it had with the disease. But the second part of the disease was very powerful and showcased by a transitional word. And she talks about basically handing over. It's like the disease is writing, this is my playbook. This is how you manage and defeat me. And it talks about things like fellowship, surrender, humility. And it's a very, very powerful poem. And so I've gotten reactions. I got this one female, she was a collegiate athlete. Um, and she was struggling with depression, alcohol, and copious marijuana use. And I read that poem to her, and she got really, really angry at me. Is because the fear of having to give up the two things, alcohol and marijuana, that was her life preserver, the thing that she believed was keeping her alive. But obviously, that's part of the unhealthiness of the disease because there's other healthy things out there. And she ended up going to treatment. When she came back, she goes, thank you for reading that poem to me. Now she says, now I get it. And so, but yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, is because it is a very provocative poem. And anyone that I've read that to in the addiction arena has said, wow, I can really relate to it. I can identify with some segment or a lot of it or a piece of it. And it's a really, really, so Joanne, whoever you are out there, thank you. You've been helping a lot of people.
One thing that I have to add to it, what caught me with the poem, um, it really speaks to what you just mentioned of it's really, the disease is really a separate entity in that the poem is actually spoken in first person. It
Hmm.
doesn't describe it abstractly as that entity over there. It says, I am your disease.
Yeah.
And the self-talk begins to take
Hmm.
over from there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what probably cuts to the core of a lot of people. And I'm bringing that up simply because I think if they get your book and they read that poem, it will enable them to say, this isn't me. It's my behavior. It is a separate entity. And all of a sudden it may click that I do need help. And it's really self-talk, my own negative
Hmm.
self-talk that's driving me to these things. That poem just kind of encapsulates so much that a person goes through in that, I'll say, the journey of recovery and treatment
Hmm.
and things like that.
Yeah.
So how does it come about, do you think, that an individual who has a disease, and I'm going to use the word disease very broadly here and say shyness or withdrawal or anything like that, how do they begin to create that identity, that mutual identity that although you are controlling me and I don't want that, I'm falling in love with you and I can't give you up. I'm becoming dependent on that psychology.
So, so Ted, apologies. So reiterate your question again.
The separate identity, they
Yeah.
read that and they say it is not me.
Yeah.
It is a second part of me, a separate entity. And I read
Hmm.
the poem and it's negative self-talk. So
Hmm.
my question is, the forming, them owning it and saying, I don't want to give up my addiction.
Okay.
How does that happen in their mind where they begin to confuse the two?
Okay. Great question as well. And if I could summarize in one word, right? And I call it the gas and the oil of the disease is fear, right? Is guilt and fear, by the way, are the if I was to, I like to use a lot of metaphors, and I look at the disease as this car, this very old rundown car, but it's fuel and gas or guilt and fear. Those are the two most powerful emotions where families are afraid to get help. They're fear that their loved one may die. They fear their loved one may never talk to them again. Or guilt. I feel guilty because I wasn't there for you. We divorced at a young age. I was an alcoholic during your teen years. And so the disease loves and thrives on those two emotions. But I would say the reason why people are afraid to give it up, and if you recall in my book, I call it the dysfunctional life preserver. It's what they believe has kept them afloat, and in some ways, it has. Whenever I talk to people in the addiction arena, I said the fact that you're alive today, somehow you found a way to make it. And for some people, the substance helped them get through their traumas or get through some in life. But what I call it is a dysfunctional marriage. It's no longer a good fit. So that's where a lot of fear is, that people truly believe the longer they've used a substance and they've been able to get through things, they believe that it is their life preserver. It's the one thing or thing that they need that they can't distance themselves from. And so what happens is they don't know what other options are. That's why getting help and treatment, like when people go to treatment, like, oh, wow, smoking marijuana to make me more social. I didn't realize that meditating in the morning or engaging in some mindfulness techniques or journaling, I didn't realize that that can be as effective or more effective than marijuana. And so what I tell people a lot is I never get in the argument of people of arguing whether they're an addict or not, whether they need to take their medication or not, or whether or not they can go and leave treatment and still drink alcohol, transition to beer if whiskey was their issue. I tell them, right, is that that lifestyle you had before coming in here is out there waiting for you. What I'm trying to do is give you options. And if, for example, if someone had whiskey as their drug of choice on their imaginary tool belt, I would tell them, I want whiskey. Whiskey is going to always be on your tool belt. I don't tell them they can never drink whiskey again. I'd say that I want that whiskey to be on your tool belt as an option. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you other options, because when you have other options, then you have other things to choose from. But I want that whiskey bottle to be way back in the back where it's hard to reach. That's where a lot of people are fearful, is because when they don't go to treatment, they don't believe they have other options. And that's why it's so important to separate themselves from environment and to be exposed to other options out there. And they believe in their unhealthiness that that is the only option I have left.
So, in giving up the disease or the addiction, how do they release themselves from fear and guilt?
Mm-hmm. That's a big one. That's a big one. And if I really, really wish I had the answer to that, one thing I could tell people who are fearful is to really know that people can get better. I've worked with the most dire of situations where people attempted suicide prior to treatment, who were overdosed on drugs, who were psychotic because of alcohol withdrawals and so forth, and they are able to reset and get healthy in their life. And it's very scary for them. So I think the biggest thing to do is know that there are people out there who care. There are resources out there to help support them, and you can get through this process. But fear is the most built in. It's okay to be scared, but it's not okay to stay scared, right? And so and guilt as well. Those people harbor of things they may have done or things they may not have done. And so, but it's like I said, I want to validate that fear is okay, but it's not okay to be paralyzed by fear, and know that there are people that can get help, continue to get help, and they can do it as well.
And in getting rid of the fear, moving on to a new level of priorities, I'll say, in your behaviors, your life preferences, putting the whiskey bottle way back there is one of your options. You have one chapter in your book. It's called Flattening the Risk Curve. Tell
Mm-hmm.
us a little bit about the risk curve and how that may help them move beyond
Mm-hmm.
those emotional factors.
So if I could define too, thank you again for bringing that up. And so just real quickly, what a risk factor is anything that puts you at risk, right? So if you, heart disease. A risk factor for heart disease is poor diet, family history, high stress levels, and so forth. And so, what we talk about is how do we lower that risk factor? You lower that risk factor with healthy diet, stress management, mindfulness, meditation skills, healthier diet, and so forth, medication if needed. And so, same model to me is that there's the opposite of risk factor are protective factors. It's sort of the antidote to the risk factors. And so for me, flattening the risk curve is, or where this came about actually was during the pandemic, and Dr. Fauci kept saying, let's flatten the risk curve of COVID. You know, how do you flatten the risk curve of COVID infection is social distance, wear a mask, and what have you. And so that's where the idea came from for me. I said, you know what? I could use that. I could translate that concept into what I try to communicate to families. And so flattening the risk curve, to flatten that out means that usually when it's high, we're at high risk or probability of relapse or using substances. And so such risk factors for people struggling with mental health or addiction are things like unresolved trauma in the family. Sometimes there's toxic relationships. Sometimes there's isolation. Sometimes there's financial distress. Sometimes there's a medical issue that's untreated. And protective factors are the opposite of that. And so the way you lower those that risk factor for curve is number one, getting rid of some of those obvious risk factors or managing it, but also having an abundance of protective factors. Okay, and so that's what I mean by that. And that's what our job to do. That risk curve will never be completely flat, meaning it will never be non-existent. Like if you have a heart disease family history or you have a history of heart disease, it's never going to be completely gone, but you have to minimize the risk factors and maximize your protective factors and always respect the capabilities. And what I feel when someone has maintained a level of sobriety, it's a perfect storm, right? Everything is lining up. And my job for people is to recognize that storm from afar, right? And by understanding the disease, okay, I'm starting to isolate. Oh, I'm starting to get angry, or I'm blaming people, or you know what? I'm not returning my family members' texts or messages. So we have to be experts on ourselves, the captains of our own ship.
Have you ever had a patient that you came to a conclusion or you seriously doubted if they could ever recover?
Honestly, I have not in this. And because where my biggest factor is, the biggest thing that's important and the impetus for writing the book is an intervention on the family, not the person struggling. It's the family unit. Because where I see most people who constantly struggle, chronically struggle, is there's some fracture in the system, the family system, whether or not someone enables them, someone's not supporting them in the healthy way, and or they are completely isolated or miscommunications. And so whenever we resolve those issues or work on those issues, people can get better. We're human social beings. We want to be connected with people. People who want to live out as hermits in the mountains, those are outliers. Those are very rare, but most of us want connection, intimate connection. And the family unit or that support system is such a vital factor. When someone first comes to treatment, so to speak, that's the easy part now. They're in treatment, they have structure, routine, they have staff members watching over them, they're taking medications. I don't focus on them because the process will take its course. It's the family unit that I have to focus on, that we have to shut down. And if you remember that, I don't know if you're going to bring that up, the 80-20 model, that 20%, the 80% of why people struggle is legitimate and valid. If someone struggles with chronic um, heroin use, right, there could be valid reasons. They may have early childhood trauma, they may abuse, they may have PTSD from serving overseas in deployment, they could have some other issues going on. 80% is legitimate and valid, but the 20% part that creates a barrier to addressing that 80% is I call the manipulation part of the disease. That's what families need to shut down, and that's where most families stay stuck, and why someone struggles for so long is they don't shut down that 20%. That 20% could be blaming, threatening that I'm going to kill myself, or threatening to leave and never talk to you again, or using emotions. All those, we have to shut that down. We can still shut that down coming from a loving place, but that's the 20%, I believe, and that's just a rough estimate. There's no hard statistics out there. That is just what I came up as the model. But that's the most critical part. And when we can shut that down, that manipulation part of the disease, every single person that I've worked with has gotten on a track to recovery.
Would it be proper, or would I be extending my understanding or concept too far? In that you can look at family treatment and therapy, but if I use a business model and I'm tapping into maybe your past industrial psychology, industrial organizational psychology work here, to use the metaphor of family and or team. And if a business really wants
Mhm,
to implement change and create teams and individuals that are
mhm.
highly engaged, which is different, I believe, than individuals who may have some disease tendencies distracting success or high performance. And I could be wrong in that. But would that metaphor go hand in hand where now if I'm treating the team is there so that they don't blame each other, but they hold each other accountable, but they support each
Exactly.
other for high performance and things like that. Does that metaphor flow through or not?
Absolutely. Whether it be a business team, an athletic team, a basketball team, a family team, and so forth. It's all, when we break it down, deconstruct it to its elements, we're all people, right? We're all still people at the end of the day, just different visions and goals at hand. And so one of my biggest things, analogies that I use is the concept of the rowboat, right? And so, if you ever been on a rowboat, to maximize velocity, distance, and speed, is everyone has to assume equal share of responsibility and work 100% on their share responsibility. And that doesn't mean everyone's equally athletic or have equal stamina or are equally skilled, but as long as they're assuming, say, a boat of four people, they're assuming 25% responsibility of whatever's going on, and they work 100%, you maximize that change factor. Because what's happened also is when you are assuming 100% equal share of responsibility, work 100%, things like accountability are in place, self accountability, holding each other accountable, being honest, open direction, structured routine. And so, absolutely, those same dynamics in the business arena, yeah, when everyone's doing their share of responsibility, and everyone's at least willing to have self introspection, work on themselves, hold each other accountable, you can really maximize the effort, and the outcomes, in those, whether it be a business team, a family team, or what have you.
So when you're working with a family, how important is it to be able to paint a different picture of the future so that they all
Mhm,
can work around that? But
mhm,
they then have to get their emotions involved because emotion drives performance. I can talk to an individual all day long, doesn't mean they're going to change their behavior at all. I got to hit that mental, emotional, I believe anyway,
mhm,
aspect so that I can then start triggering different behaviors.
mhm,
But how do I do it? And would it be a picture of the future, or in business terms, they'll call it vision? But how do you begin? What's the proper way of going in and being able to work with that family unit?
mhm. Well, two parts to that. Number one is, one thing I talk about in my 12 steps is they have to create a unified vision. It's critically important. It's very hard to know where we're going if we don't have a vision or a map or an architecture or a blueprint to where we're going. And so that's why goal setting is critically important. And of course, using SMART goals where these are very tangible, identifiable goals. But having a unified vision among the team is critically important. For example, hey, we wanted him to, this person, let's say a son, we want to get a treatment in 1 year is the vision, and what's that going to look like. They're going to go into some residential treatment for at least 3 months and step down to intensive outpatient, partial hospitalization, individual counseling, 12-step recovery, what have you. And so I think having a unified vision is critically important. Where I see a lot of people struggle is that they have separate visions. The loved one who's struggling. And so, but then we want them to be a part of that vision as well when the time is right. The other thing too that's important is, you mentioned about emotions. Emotions are critically important. We talked about that earlier about emotional IQ, but emotions to me are critical part. It's a part of who we are. It's data, it's information, it's our body's response to something. However, emotions, when we're not in our healthiest space, can be very, very misguiding. But on many levels, stress, anxiety, low to moderate levels of stress, anxiety, and fear are actually beneficial. That's what makes you prepare for a presentation. When you have moderate levels of anxiety, that's what makes you prepare for the Olympics. And so emotions are critically important when we're in our healthiest self. And there's a saying, feelings are meant to be felt, they're not fact. A lot of people, where they struggle is they use emotions as fact. I'm mad at you, therefore I don't want to work with you, right? Or I got frustrated with you, therefore we can't collaborate. Feelings are meant to be felt and not fact, and that's critically important. But feeling emotions are critically important. That's one way to build rapport with someone, and there's different ways you can do that. But it's in how you recognize and use the emotions in an effective way. But yeah.
I love that saying the emotions are felt but not fact. Would that lead to perhaps an insight of saying the IQ plus EQ need to balance each other? IQ
Hmm.
being the rational aspect of the
Hmm.
mind needs to be able to lead emotion, because if not, you have irrational behavior and you generally get in trouble when that happens. Would
Hmm.
that be accurate on your part? The best thing we can do is a healthy mind begin to balancing IQ with EQ in whatever
Absolutely.
environment I'm in.
Absolutely. There's a saying out there that I came across that someone told me is just because our head and our heart attach the same body doesn't mean they always get along. When we think too much with our head, right, that's not good. When we think too much with our heart, that's not good. But to be able to have a nice symbiosis between those two, I find as to be the most effective decisions is when we are understanding that emotional part, that part of the person and where they're coming from, but also thinking on a cognitive level as well, an intellectual level as well. So that's what I generally like to tell people is what is your head telling you is what is your heart telling you. Okay. And usually most of the time they're able to come up with a very, very good decision for them and the most effective decision and best informed decision when they balance those two.
So, in reading your book, this is an observation that I've had. I'm not saying it's in your book or implied, but it seemed to be that when you get into group therapy or the family therapy, I'm going to say, what's really important is being able to accept feedback from each other. If you can't
Mhm.
accept the feedback, you're really not moving ahead in self awareness or building that
Mhm.
awareness of how you are impacting other people. Um, would it be valid then to add IQ, EQ, and feedback as being balancing parts of a healthy mind and
Oh
being
yes.
able to be highly engaged?
Yes, yes, yes. And not sure if you recall, I do write about the three most effective and consistent attributes to people who are successful or progress in the recovery. I call it the disease vaccine, and
Mhm.
one of them is being open to direction. Those are one of the most important factors, and not just in dealing with addiction. It's in any one area of life. Being open to direction is being able to be open to feedback, critical feedback, and as growth for change. James Clear, who is the author of Atomic Habits, who I quote a lot, said, like a setback or a failure is simply data in which to grow. And that's what you differentiate people who progress in life who don't. People who have a setback or failure, it's data information. What do we do? How do we learn from it? How do we grow from it? People who struggle said, oh, it's a deficiency, it's a missed opportunity. And so absolutely emotional IQ and, intellectual IQ and all those things are a critical component. Being open to feedback, one of the biggest areas of my life I believe, take my life game to the next level is inviting feedback. Tell me, what I can improve. And I am, one thing I do talk about as well is I compete in a martial art, which constantly gives you feedback and you're humbled every single day on that mat. And you're humbled. And I'm always asking, what can I do better? What did I do? And it's there's a saying, you either win or you learn, and that's it. And so yes, to answer your question, absolutely, all of those fall under the umbrella of being open to direction.
So, if you can do that, in effect, would I be correct in saying you're moving beyond self interest and your ego, if you will, using
Mhm.
that word loosely, but you're moving beyond self interest now into a little bit more inclusive and group interest,
Mhm.
and not
Yeah.
doing just what benefits you, but understanding if we perform together, we all benefit together.
Mhm.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, for sure. And I believe that. I said, if anyone ever tells you, whether it be in the business arena, their prowess or success as an athlete or what have you, if everyone ever says, I did this all on my own, no. They've had, whether it be a parent guiding them, a mentor, a coach, a teacher, support of a friend, everyone has had some help along the way. And you see these successful people recognize that. And no one's ever done it on their own. And so the fact is how critically important it is to have a fellowship, a healthy fellowship of people around you. And I tell people all the time that if surround yourself with people who will bring out your best self. And if someone's not going to bring out your best self, you have to really decide whether or not I can include them in my circle. It's not a judgment on the person, It just means, hey, if you're not aligned with my values and where I'm heading, it's not a judgment on you. You're not, our relationship is just not a good fit for me. And especially if someone's not willing to do the work, right? Doesn't mean you can't be of service to others and help other people. You can't develop and teach people, but it's those people who don't want to do the work. They become a heavyweight.
You mentioned in your book that I want to move into, if we can, different phases of recovery. But I want to
Mm-hmm.
talk about them, if I can, using an
Sure.
example that shows proof of recovery in each of the phases. And let's say that there's an individual that comes to you that, let's say they're a narcissist. They can't accept anybody being better. They're right in everything. They always have the right way of doing it. And they just can't break free from this. They got a problem with it. If you put them through your therapy approach and your treatments, and you take them through the family, and as they begin to recover, how will their behaviors begin to change? What will be the signals that these phases of recovery are actually taking place and showing some concrete return?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you bring up the narcissism part, and so one of the biggest things is when working with people's understanding their language. A lot of times people, I mean, this is true that people who are truly, authentically, accurately diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, right? If they truly have that diagnosis, they actually lack the gray matter in the brain for empathy, or
Hmm.
very limited gray matter in empathy. And that's like telling a blind person to see. And people, that's what they do, is they try to talk to someone who truly, because one thing I want to say too, and I'm glad you mentioned that, is a lot of times we use the word narcissism very, very flippantly, right? Just like back in the day, a child is restless and not paying attention, all of a sudden we give them the label of ADHD, right? and so
Mhm.
um and so narcissism also, we have to use that very, very carefully, is because whenever someone's just focusing on their own needs, all of a sudden they're a narcissist. And I believe on some social arenas it's really created this demarcation, the separation of labeling someone that. But truly someone who has narcissistic personality disorder, which is less empathy for others. They struggle with moral decisions. Focuses on themselves. They need this constant need for validation and recognition. And if they truly have that, they lack the empathy. And so, trying to teach someone truly with narcissistic personality disorder to have empathy, like, wow, don't you understand? These people are crying and they're so sad. They're not going to hear that. So you have to talk in their language, because and that language would be, what do they benefit from? How can you talk to that language? And so that would be awareness. Not to say that they can't have self-awareness. I'm not saying forever that maybe they could develop empathy at some point. But what happens is we don't change the strategy or language, which is the theme of my book. We come from a loving place, but we just got to change the strategy. So the phase of recovery, you mentioned that. The reason why that came about is because I get a lot of families and people struggling of all these questions. Well, why is my daughter still thinking of killing herself? She's on antidepressants for 3 months. Or why does my son still have cravings for alcoholism? He's been sober for 6 months. And so you get all these questions. And so I divided up the process into 4 phases. And the first phase is like the first 30 to 90 days. Phase two is 3 months to 1 year. Phase three is 1 to 2 years, and phase four is 2 years plus. What happens in each of those phases are some general but distinct changes that can take place. The phase one, first 30 to 90 days, that's when you're going to get the resistance that I hate you. I don't want to get better. I'm done with this. The relapse. And phase two, they take on a higher level of goals as they heal. Phase three, take on bigger goals as well. So absolutely, the part of that process is hopefully they stabilize. If they need medication, they're getting medication. They're finding healthier coping skills. They're getting through withdrawals of the substance. The families are changing. They're learning new patterns. They're surrounding themselves with healthier people. So it's a progressive change. And I look at 1 year, and many clinicians would agree, 1 year is early recovery. Does that mean that they're in residential treatment for 1 year? No. That means, though, they have some level of step down process to maximize, lower their risk factors and maximize their chance for long term success.
So one time I was listening to a um, interview with a very, very famous musician who was an alcoholic, substance
Okay.
abuser. And he said, I have to keep reminding myself every single day, if I am not in recovery, I'm going to lose everything. And I all go back. I give everything up. So is that
Mhm.
in your book, you make mention to it in the path to lifelong recovery, that that's one of
Mhm.
the things, understanding that recovery isn't a short-term, one-time off effect
Oh,
or
no,
or
no.
job.
It is, and you're glad you brought it up. And I'll give you my number two out of
Hmm.
my three. I'll give you two out of three of the three. I believe the most critical factors for successful recovery. Number three was open direction, but number two was humility. Right? If you look at the in the dictionary, humility is the byproduct of having been humiliated. Right? That's where it comes from, being humble. And so where that comes into play is you have to respect your disease and its capabilities. Whenever we disrespect anything, things can happen. If you're a scuba diver and you disrespect the capabilities of the ocean, what can happen there. If you're an avid skier, you disrespect the weather report, what can happen there. If you're a skydiver and you disrespect the turbulence, what can happen there. And so we always have to respect the capabilities of what we're up against, and in this case, a disease. And humility is definitely one of them. And if I may share, you may have read this. There was one gentleman who I worked with who was struggling with alcohol and cocaine for much of his life, and he got sober, and he's been sober for probably 60 years now. And but he says to this day that if you put a line of cocaine in front of me right now, he goes, I can't guarantee you I won't snort it. That's 60 years of sobriety. That been a clinician, has his own treatment place, sponsored so many people, because he knows that if he finds himself even remotely in a room with cocaine, he's lost already. It's checkmate. And so he didn't say like, "Oh, I got 60 years recovery. I'm good. It won't affect me. It won't phase me. I won't even think about it." No, he says he respects the capability. It doesn't mean it takes over his life. He just respects his capability. And so absolutely what you're alluding to is humility. That gentleman you were speaking, that musician, is that he knows what road that can go down, and he could play that tape forward really, really quickly.
And where does the aspect of accountability come into play?
Accountability. So accountability is these entities that will hold you accountable and responsible to. And so, for example, when people leave early treatment, I tell them you need at least three to five people that will hold you accountable, and that's not going to be mom, dad, husband, child, and cousin. Now, as long as they're healthy, I'll include those as one entity. You want these entities, these people who will hold you accountable and aren't afraid to tell you when something's not going right. That could be your therapist, psychiatrist, a sponsor from a sobriety meeting. That could be a mentor, a peer. But five entities that will hold you accountable. And we all need that. We all need some form of accountability, every single one of us. And you could be accountable also to a family, a job. But I like people is because people can give you feedback. You can connect with them, you can call them. And so that's what I mean by accountability. And it's another critical element for success. I talk about structure, having structure to our day, because boredom is a huge risk factor. Because if we're bored, we get in our head, and that's discomfort, and we're going to find something to relieve that discomfort. And usually, if it's a substance, it's going to be a substance. And then routine is our own personalized event things that we do in our daily life, and then accountability. Three critical elements that are important in a good treatment program. Those are the elements that are there that provide that. And so, but accountability is a critical component.
So it sounds to me that recovery is something that's almost everybody should be partaking in because we all have something to recover from. We all have some trauma in our life, et cetera. To some degree, it's much, much worse, obviously, than with other
Mhm.
people. But the whole endeavor of intelligence, self-intelligence, working on yourself is something that we have to take very seriously. How do you look at the future? How do you look at the course of your lifetime, what's happened and the progression in the different fields of therapy and things like that? Are we making progress? Is it getting better? Or are we still, we're still in the dark ages here?
Well, I think there's a direct correlation. I believe that the level of risks that are going up, the level of substances that are out there, the level of accessibility to substances and unhealthy coping has gone up, as well as education, research, and for treating that. And so, are we making a breakthrough? Here's the risk factors, and it's very hard to tell. But if anything, at least for the United States, I believe we are gradually and making great progress on destigmatizing mental health. Whenever you have an athlete, high profile person, that singer or musician that you said, that come out and are vulnerable enough and humble enough to say, you know what, I struggle, that literally saves lives. And you see a lot more musicians and athletes talking about their depression. The passing of Robin Williams, I could tell you, for about 2 weeks straight, was so impactful. And not only we think, oh well, he was Mork and Mindy, and he was in Good Will Hunting and all these movies. But no, one time I saw the news and this 5-year old girl was crying. So why is she crying for Robin Williams? Because he was Aladdin. And so, whenever someone impactful like that, and I think it really hit people hard, is because here Robin Williams is an iconic person, a legend, top of his career, family, and he succumbs to suicide. And so, not to say that we would want a tragedy to happen, but whenever people talk about their own mental health and you get a lot more celebrities, I think it's very, very powerful. I think social media has also been very powerful in spreading those messages. Of course, it also can work on the contrary with spreading not so positive messages. But I do believe we are moving towards a destigmatization. I'm hoping it's happening globally. I know the UK is very big on mental health resources, but we definitely have a ways to go. And my job is to be impactful, hopefully on a grander scale through avenues like this. And I really appreciate, by the way, what you are doing and reaching out on a spectrum of the business arena that we were talking about earlier. That yes, they're business people, but they're still people. They're humans. They go home, they cry, they stress, they're happy, they're sad, they have friendships, and outside that role, their business is just one part of their life. And so addressing mental health, I think, is very, very critical.
And where do you see yourself, Dr. Brian, going in the future? What's your future look like to you?
Well, for right now, definitely going out there and promoting my book, because my book, I believe, can help a lot of families, and not only families that are in crisis, but for people who are looking for long-term recovery. I really believe it can really instill hope with people. So that's my main goal in these near future, is to really get out there, but definitely spread my message of mental health awareness and hope and education on a grander scale, whether it be media appearances like podcasts, TV shows, which I'm already doing, or writing articles. That is my vision and passion.
So I have one question I have to ask you because I know I will regret it for a long time if I don't. Do you kind of get a smile on your face when you're involved in family therapy and let's say someone comes in with a substance abuse and the family starts interconnecting and working and you look at it and you say, well, this person brought them in, but that's not the person with the real problem. This is the person. And then they all start kind of like connecting off of each other. Does that mean and say to you, okay, it's starting to work?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
When people are able to do that and have some self inward look, to me, it's already working. And that's what it is. It's because we're so used to doing this, that saying that when you do this, there's 3 fingers pointing right back at you. And if we're all able, there's a saying that, there's I think 8 billion people in the world. If everyone was to actually try to be their better self, right? Imagine how powerful the world would be.
Yeah. So, Dr. Brian, if someone wants to get in touch with you, how do they contact you? What's the best way?
You can reach me at drbrianlicuanan.com. That's my website. And my website there has my other media appearances and articles I've written, has my book there as well. You could also catch me on Instagram at Dr. Licuanan. I'm also on TikTok at Dr. Licuanan as well, and YouTube at Dr. Brian Licuanan as well.
And we'll have all those listed also at the end of the show. I would like to also mention that I highly recommend your book, How to Get Your Resisting Loved One into Treatment. Very powerful stuff and very common language that a lot of people will understand. So,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Brian, I have to tell you, this is one of the best conversations I've had. You seem like a very, very well refined individual who's working on
Thank you.
themselves, but I love the conversation, your insights and your knowledge. I would love to be able to see you take this book and your concept very far. So if there's anything we can do, love to help you.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you so much.
And thank you for being here today. Appreciate your time.
Appreciate you.
Hi, Ted Wolf here. I want to thank you for joining us for this Implementors video. The Implementors podcast is presented by Guidewise, where we, along with our vetted member community, recognize that ideas are easy, but implementation is hard. To learn more about getting things done with Guidewise, please visit us at guidewise.io. And to conquer your implementation struggles, please like and share this video and subscribe to our channel. Happy implementing.